Okay, good morning, everyone. If we could all get seated. Thank you all for being here this morning. My name is Oge Onubogu, and I'm the director of the Africa program here at the Wilson Center. It's a delight to welcome you today to this conversation as we explore greater synergy between international and domestic election observation. For those of you who are unfamiliar with the Wilson Center or the Wilson Center Africa program, this program works to address some of the most critical issues facing U.S.-Africa relations. Our conversation today is held under the banner of the Southern Voices Network for Peacebuilding, SVNP. SVNP was established in 2011. This is a Wilson Center Africa program that is supported by the Carnegie Corporation of New York. And in this program, it is a group of over 20 Pan-African organizations made up of African policy, research, or academic organizations that work closely with the Wilson Center to bring African knowledge and perspectives to the U.S., African, and international audience. So I'm going to turn it over to our moderator today, Mr. Tobias Glucksmann, who is our Senior State Department Fellow, and he will be moderating this discussion today. So Toby, I'll hand it over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Oge, and thanks to all of you who are, and welcome to all of those of you who are joining us here in person today, and also online. As Auge mentioned, I'm one of several State Department Senior Diplomatic Fellows here at the Wilson Center, and I'm delighted to be monitoring this presentation by and discussion with Galileo and Njanje this morning. Galileo is, as Oge had mentioned, is a Wilson Center Southern Voices Network Peacebuilding Scholar. She will be presenting today on the topic of her current research at the Wilson Center, which focuses on improving synergy between international and domestic election observers. Specifically, she will address perceptions of recent democratic backsliding across the African continent. She will assess shortfalls in international and local election monitoring and coordination, and she'll provide policy recommendations. As most of us in this room know, and I suspect those online, these are hot topics in Africa these days, and also for those who follow the continent closely. I know I have myself enjoyed following her research. So we'll expect many of you to come forward with questions after she makes her presentation. Galileo hails from Botswana. She has worked closely with her country's electoral management body. She has served as a research consultant for the Institute for Security Studies in Pretoria, as well as a researcher for the Southern African Peacebuilding Organization, the Action Support Center. She has also collaborated with the Training for Peace Secretariat, the African Policy Circle, and SADC's Council of NGOs. She holds a Master's of Art in Politics from the University of Johannesburg. After her presentation, as I mentioned, we'll open it up for questions, so please have yours ready. For those of you joining online, please write your questions in the chat. And if you do ask a question, please state your name and any organization you're affiliated with. So without further ado, I will hand it over to Galileo.
Thank you so much, Oge and Tobias. Good morning, everyone. The outline of my presentation is as follows. We have the introduction, international election observation and the local 10, existing coordination between domestic election observation and international election observation, and then we'll conclude with recommendations. Indeed, this conversation is happening at a critical time where in Africa we are witnessing more and more a reversal of democratic gains of the 1990s, where African countries began to hold multi-party elections as a way of transferring political power and institutionalizing democratic governance. But now, in recent years, citizens do not trust those institutions anymore. And that is indicated in the growing voter apathy. The Afrobarometer survey of 2019 to 2021 conducted in 34 countries in Africa shows that only 42% of Africans believe elections in their respective countries effectively ensure that parliament representatives reflect the views of the voters. Otherwise, popular perception is that elections fail to transfer into the electorate's desire for accountable democratic institutions, do not lead to change of leaders, nor are they free and fair. We also have instances of election-related violence in countries like Kenya, in the past in Zimbabwe, in countries like Burundi. There's also a tendency of incumbent presidents to extend their presidential term limits. And of course, the recent coups in the Sahel region are also an indicator of the reversal of democratic gains of the 1990s.
Can I have you bend your microphone a little closer?
Okay.
Folks online are having problems here.
Hearing me, okay. So given that background, then we had the US and countries from the European Union. The 1990s sort of coincided with the end of the Cold War. We saw the US and European Union countries begin to observe elections in Africa to detect and deter electoral fraud, curb civil disobedience and violence, promote credibility of an electoral process. And as the continent experiences now in this moment that we are in, the decline of democracy, the scholarship of the subject now is beginning to also scrutinize and criticize international election observation in Africa. And some of the reasons why it is criticized is because of their short period of deployment, where they would deploy normally around 3 to 6 months, but it's such a short period that they do not get to witness some of the electoral processes, especially in the pre and the post-electoral phases. And then that is where now governments capitalize to manipulate some of the processes, and we have an election that is not worthy or it's not legitimate. We also have seen instances where they endorse unworthy governments, like in Malawi and in Kenya in 2017, Malawi in 2019, the courts had to overturn the outcome of an election and annul the elections, but international election observers had endorsed those elections. And there is also an issue of divergent verdicts, but this one is whether it's an issue of scope or motives or methodology, that is still an issue on the table. And then when all of this is unfolding, there's also greater advocacy really among the policymakers, academics, and practitioners for sort of now having domestic election observers being the ones who are doing this work more and more, because they hold significant prospects for localizing and engendering local ownership of democracy promotion efforts. They're advocating for these civil society organizations because they better understand the local context and culture, and their close proximity to the political environment also gives them an opportunity to engage even after the elections have passed. And we have seen, again, I must bring it up here, that international election observers would also go to local civil society organizations for more information that they might have missed during the times when they are not in the environment of the elections. And we do have a growing number of these civil society organizations that are doing incredible work in monitoring the political environment during the whole electoral cycle. In Zambia, for example, we have the Christian Churches Monitoring Group that was credited for doing parallel vote tabulation that successfully saw the conduct of elections in Zambia. We also have the Catholic Church in the DRC. It's been engaged in the environment in the DRC since 2006. In Nigeria, Yaga Africa is also doing incredible work, and also they try to get some knowledge from other countries. They're not just confined to Nigeria. They recently went and observed elections in Liberia also. So we are advocating, or our policymakers are advocating for domestic election observation, but it also encounters challenges in the environment that it operates in. Insecurity and limited resource capacity. Again, we see the linkages with international election observers where their presence sort of provides security for domestic election observer missions, and they also capacitate them with technical skills and funding. There have been some efforts to coordinate the synergy between DO and IEO, but obviously in forming the global network of domestic election monitors. So obviously it provides a springboard for a more integrated approach of collaboration, because in this framework, you find again that Western election observers are not included. Of course, it's a domestic election monitors group of groups across Asia, in Africa, Latin America, which was formulated by the help of the NDI, but you still find that it's them, and we don't find a greater engagement of INGOs, I must say, in this model. So it provides a springboard for integrated partnership between IEO and DEO, because this actually would help with the credibility and influence of international election observation as it is waning in Africa. It will also help to strengthen the collaboration with domestic election observers. So how this would look like, I suggest they would have to give joint statements. They would have to have maybe civil society organization leaders also lead international election observation missions, and also the methodology or the legal framework. They should ensure that it's one legal framework that they use, because you find INGOs or international election observers from the West, they would be using international legal frameworks, whereas domestic election observers would be using their own domestic legal framework. I also suggest that frameworks like the ACDEC, African Charter on Democracy, Elections and Governance, should include punitive measures. It does talk about the safety of domestic election observers or election observers, that governments should provide an environment that is safe for them, but there's no consequence for when the environment is not safe. So that's one of the suggestions. I also suggest that donor governments should incentivize political will and implementation of observer missions recommendations. Normally you find recommendations are not implemented in most governments. Just recently the EU decried in Zimbabwe that the recommendations they had made following 2018 elections were not implemented for 2023 elections. And funding should also be contingent on enhanced synergy between IEO and DO. Thank you.
Okay.
Thanks. Can we encourage everyone to come to the table? If you're sitting at the back, there's room at the table. Please come to
Yeah.
the table.
Please join us at the table so we can have a more intimate conversation. Thank you so much for that thought-provoking presentation, Galileo. It's now time for questions. So as moderator, I'm going to take the liberty and ask the first one. So you're a native of Africa and someone who has observed closely recent and past elections throughout the continent. How significant, what's your impression of how significant this current trend of democratic backsliding is across Africa? And what role is Africa's burgeoning youth population playing in fueling or combating that trend?
Thank you, Toby, for that question. You know, what comes to my mind right now, I'm thinking, we have instances where democracy is genuinely growing, like in my country, Botswana, where you have seeing some of the things unfold that were not normally there in the political environment. Like now, political parties are demanding to observe. Sorry, I'll have to wait. Political parties are demanding to observe voter registration. It's rare. It wasn't normally done like that. But then you see the reversal in democracy in other countries where there is like internet shutdowns, there is the extension of presidential term limits, there is no delivering of development needs of the citizens, and you see more and more youth, because youth make the largest population in Africa, you see more and more youth having dialogues on these issues. They convene usually in X spaces, I guess that's what it's called now. And I feel like this can be harnessed so that they play a greater role in transforming political environments of the African countries that they live in, because there is willingness of the youth. They are there, they are doing some work, they're having dialogues with their counterparts in other countries, but the potential of the youth really needs to be harnessed. They should be skilled, they should be provided credible information to can engage better and make impact in their countries.
Okay, thank you. So the floor is open to any questions. I just ask that if you do ask a question, again, state your name and affiliation, and then also speak up. Apparently there's some challenges in hearing what's being said online. Any questions from the room? We have one in the chat, which I can convey now. Do we have someone anonymous on the chat? I'm not sure who this is, but they say, we have seen a surge in cases where local observer organizations are attacked or have members arrested. Is there an international support mechanism for such organizations, like the recent attack of ZESN in the just ended elections in Zimbabwe?
I think it takes me back to my recommendation of punitive action that should be included in the legal frameworks of African countries, like the African Charter on Democracy, Elections, and Governance. It talks about how governments should provide a safe environment for election observers, but does not give a consequence to what would happen if that is not the case. Security, it's really a big problem. Security of election observers, it's really a big issue in Africa. So he is right. It has to be included, and there has to be action taken when such happen. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Yes?
Good morning. Thank you so much for your presentation. My name is Joanna Spear. I'm a Wilson Center Fellow at the moment. This is not my area of expertise, but it's very interesting to me. And I'm wondering if you can unpack a bit for me what the process of harmonizing domestic and international legal frameworks would look like, who might do it, and whose international framework and whose domestic frameworks, because I can see there might be an awful lot going on here. So if you could explain that a bit, that'd be really helpful.
Thank you, Joanna, for that question. So maybe I'll just start by explaining who international election observers are. They're usually INGOs from the US or Europe. They're usually intergovernmental organizations like the European Union or African Union or SADC or ECOWAS. So those are international election observers. And then we have civil domestic election observers, which can range from, depending on the focus, your scope, can be civil society organizations, party agents, can be churches, faith-based organizations, and anyone else who wants to be an observer really, because accreditation can be open to a wide range of actors locally. And so talking about the legal framework, international election observers do have the legal framework. We have the Declaration of International Election Observers, that is the UN framework that guides all other observers. But then regional organizations also have their own legal framework. You have the SADC Declaration of Elections, you have the African Charter that I've been talking about, and then going down into the local context now, you have the Electoral Act, you have the Constitution, and other legal frameworks within the nation that guides the processes. So harmonizing, as I suggested, they should use one legal framework. And if it's in the context of Botswana in a country, then why don't we use what Botswana use instead of using the UN declaration? Because ultimately, whatever legal framework we probably have drawn from other international legal framework, and it's important that you contextualize the work that you're doing. So it would be better, in my view, to use domestic legal framework to observe the elections within a domestic context. Thank you.
Okay, any other questions? There's a microphone coming. So.
Good. I'm not affiliated with anybody, but I was wondering, you talked about the context. One of the contexts in terms of the present controversy is in the fact in this country we have just gone through a set of controversies in connection with the 2020 election and resulting conflicts, and these overlap with the fact that we have a lot of rules about election observers and, in fact, a fair amount of case law on how those are dealt with. But these are typically domestic people, actually typically connected with one or the other party in the election. How has that affected both election observers, domestic election observers in Africa, and the more general discussion? Thank you.
Sorry, I'm not sure I got the question.
The effect of the controversy in the United States about the 2020 election on the discussion in Africa of how to observe elections and presumably protect the people who are involving in observing.
Yeah. No, I get that. But so contextually, there are sentiments about foreign observers coming to observe elections in Africa. And I would imagine that it is a problem when a country that is perceived as a guarantor of democracy in Africa would have internal issues that even within their own domestic context, election observers are not regarded as actors that can do something within that context. So it definitely becomes an issue, and there are sentiments, and that is why today we're having this conversation that actually instead of saying we want our people to observe the elections, we should look at the interlinkages of international election observation and domestic election observation in Africa, because they do strengthen each other in some way. And so instead of doing, but generally there are sentiments about foreign meddling in Africa, and so, yeah.
Okay, thank you. But please wait for the microphone so those online can hear.
Yeah, thank you. My name is Jude Mutam with the National Endowment for Democracy. Thank you. My question is around international elections observation. You mentioned that the recommendations are hardly implemented. So I'm wondering, is international election observation still important? I know sometimes the recommendations could lead to sanctions, but again, the process of sanction is not clear. So what is the use of international election observation? And lastly, when do international observers start engaging with the local observers? Is it just 3 months to the elections, you come in and do your thing, provide recommendations that are not respected, and then you leave?
That's a very good question. I think international election observation is still important in Africa, given the context within which elections take place, and also just given the relationship between the West and Africa, and also just the security issues that threaten, if anything was to happen, that would destabilize either the U.S. or Africa. So I believe international election observation is still important to a certain extent. And also their presence does really help, even though there are issues with that, of motives, of their scope and methodology, but to a certain extent, I believe they are relevant for the work of domestic election observers especially. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. Can we go back to, there's a question online that goes back to the question of international election observer missions and what sort of framework you use. So let me just read it out. It's from Bright Chamidza, who is a political analyst for looks like the European Union Election Observer Mission for Zimbabwe. And the question is, looking at the models used by various international election observer missions, which international observer mission employs a methodology which is somewhat watertight?
I'm not sure really. I'm not sure if there is a methodology that is watertight. I feel like just as it's identified that there has to be some clause that speaks to the safety and action taken against governments that provide an unsafe environment for domestic election observers, you always find loopholes. So I'm not sure if we would really have a legal framework that is watertight, but yeah.
Okay,
Can I ask a question?
please.
Kalelo, thank you so much for your presentation. I want to go back to a point that you made earlier on in your presentation when you spoke about just the data coming from Afrobarometer and the fact that a lot of young people are not citizens in general, have a concern with the electoral process and with elections in general. Now you talk about creating greater synergy between domestic election observers and international election observers, but from the landscape that you've painted on the continent, there is a much larger question or a much larger discussion happening about just the state of democracy. So what are recommendations that you would put forward as you think about creating this synergy to also address some of the larger questions on democracy and citizen trust in the electoral process?
I'm not sure what that question requires, really. But looking at the synergy that I'm talking about for institutionalizing democracy in Africa, I think I'll go back again to my recommendations that we need to see leaders of civil society organizations being included in international election observation missions as leaders of those missions. Firstly, this will give, as I have also alluded to, voter apathy. Firstly, this will give confidence to the electorate who are usually working with civil society organizations. They see civil society organizations, leaders, regularly, maybe through civic and voter education, maybe through the advocacy projects. So if they see them also heading some of these missions, I think it would give them the impression that there is that synergy and they can trust the electoral processes more, because they see people who are advocating all the time, usually working with international election observers, I think.
Okay, if I can follow up to that response. So having local election observers join international observers, I think in the past, in some instances, we've seen that the local observers tend to come under criticism that they're a little bit too close to the international observers and they may be serving international foreign interests rather than serving the interests of their own country. And so it opens them up to a certain amount of criticism and, perhaps undermines their credibility, their efficacy, and perhaps even in some cases their own personal security. So how would you set up a system where they could join and yet still maintain their credibility and not come under attack in that manner?
Toby, I'm thinking the question you're asking is more government perceptions of civil society organizations and international organizations rather than, citizen perceptions, because I feel like citizens would be in support of that synergy, and democracy really is about the citizens more than it is about the governments. The governments are there, administrations are there because of the citizens, and so if citizens themselves who are civil society organizations do not see a problem of working with international election observer missions, I think really governments should not be an issue in this instance, although they are an issue because they make the laws and the rules. But if citizens themselves who form these governments through their participation in electoral processes do not have a problem with civil society organizations who are citizens themselves working with international election observer missions, I don't think it should be an issue for.
Okay, great. Any more questions? I'm just looking online. Yes, please.
Thank you for the great presentation. This is just a follow-up, maybe building on what Oge asked about just democracy more broadly. And particularly, you mentioned Ghana as a beacon of democracy. And as a Ghanaian, the electoral process recently has had a couple of concerns, especially with the government using what I would call legal means to set up the electoral process in a way that may disenfranchise some people. So, for example, the government implemented a new identity system called the Ghana card, and then went ahead to require that as the main registration instrument. So if you don't have the Ghana card, then you can register to vote in the election. So I feel your recommendation about pre-election observation is really important, but how do we reposition that so that we can capture some of these legal ways that governments are sometimes trying to influence the outcomes of elections even before people go to the ballots?
Sorry, are Ghana cards identity cards, or are they national identity cards, or is?
Yeah.
So the government issues the national identity card?
Yes.
At what age?
So at the voting age, 18. So the identity card is for everyone, but then you need to have it before you can register to vote. But here's the case, it's the process of getting the card wasn't so decentralized that in rural areas, for example, there are a lot of people who still don't have the card. But then there's an election that's upcoming. To me, there's a likelihood so many people wouldn't get to get onto the new voter register. And so civil society organizations, there have been demonstrations, but it looks legal to say that if you don't have the Ghana card, you can't vote, or you can't get onto the voter register. But morally, it doesn't sound good. So I'm just asking your recommendation about pre-election observation as something that should be very central to the electoral process. What institutional provisions may be made, especially that you have international purview of some sort? Maybe the UN or some organizations may be able to come in and probably say, well, you need to have the baseline conditions for everyone to get registered, even if you are going to use a new identity system
Yeah.
before you go to the polls.
Or then do we not trust the judiciary system in Ghana for citizens to can get a court order to facilitate for that issuance of identity cards?
So it gets interesting. The
Yeah, because we need the whole context. We need the whole context.
So Parliament,
Yeah.
which is like representing the people,
Yeah.
right, actually passed this provision. But the minority, so Parliament now is divided. It's just, let me say, a minority by a single parliamentarian in Ghana now. So it was 50-50, but then the ruling government got a majority through a judicial decision that brought on another parliamentarian, right? So it's a dicey situation. The minority can't really push because they don't have the numbers, right? But then this gets passed in Parliament, and I don't think you can say it's illegal because it's Parliament that's saying, yeah, this is a positive vote at the end of the day. But when you look at it morally, a lot of people won't get to vote because of that identity system that is being instituted.
Yeah. Yeah, that's true, and it's just now I remembered something that's happening in Botswana now, because like I mentioned, in the past years we didn't have party agents observing voter registration in polling stations, and so they went to the courts, and the registration process had to be postponed for the ruling to be made on whether party agents are going to observe the voter registration or not. And I should believe that it's happening. I haven't followed what happened with that, but I should believe that the ruling would be in favor of party agents observing the voter registration process. So that is why I'm asking, so do we not trust the judiciary that we can, I know elections are an expensive process, and also postponing an election can cause other problems. So in this instance, really, I'm not sure I'm not quite sure who should be doing what, but I'm sure the courts should be able to handle an issue like that. Or there should be voter registration and supplementary voter registration while they are pushing the administrative institution to issue the Ghana cards. So you have supplementary voter registration until you get the majority of the people that haven't gotten the cards to register. Because I remember for the 2019 elections, we had quite a number of supplementary voter registrations to get people to register in the numbers that we know or had expected them to register for the elections.
Okay, I don't have any other. Okay, another question from the same individual, Bright Chamidze, who's a political analyst with the EU. What do you think can be done? What do you think can be done to limit the cherry picking of international observer missions allowed to observe elections in a specific country? Past events have shown that some observer missions are not allowed to observe elections, or some are deported as events unfold.
Yeah, so this is an issue of interest, right? Geopolitical interests that also play into the election observation practice. And really it makes one wonder if it's even worth it in some contexts to have election observers or to even invite them, because sometimes you invite them but you already know, like it's been alluded, they have rigged the election already, it's done. And yeah, but election observers should also be at liberty to say, we are not coming to observe an election that would dent our credibility, because we're going to observe an election, but we already know that really we're just doing it. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. Another question from Milky Bakel, who's one of our Africa Program staff interns here at the Wilson Center. Going back to your point on the ways that international election observers use international legal frameworks to implement election observation, are there instances where domestic election observers have worked with international election observers to educate them on their domestic legal frameworks to ensure better synergy between them?
So domestic election observers are educating international election observers?
Right, on local legal frameworks.
Yeah. I think I did mention that sometimes you get civil society organization personnel co-opted into international election observer missions for basically that purpose, to inform them of the legal framework, to the political context, some of the things that have been happening that they might not be aware of. There are those consultations that happen when international election observers get into a country to observe the elections. Yeah.
Thank you. Any? Yes.
Okay, thank you very much for the wonderful presentation. My question focused on your recommendation. So you said we need to incentivize political will. So would you please elaborate on that? What would be the possible mechanisms that we incentivize governments to commit such kind of engagements, while there is also political power that's giving them more energy and incentive to engage on the other side? So, thank you.
I think the EU did something like that in Zimbabwe recently. They had given them money for the reform of the electoral management body, and then after the elections, they took it back. So, yeah, they did take it back. So I feel like in such instances, it is better to let the institution have money to do the reform. But I'm not sure in the context of Zimbabwe if this will work. I mean, for the EU to take the money back, then it means it might be a problem even for the institutions to be reformed. But in other contexts, I believe incentivizing political will for reform would really work. Yeah.
I'm Ristella Heiser. I'm sorry you walked in just as you were completing your presentations, but my question is, based on your experience, I'm not sure if you're familiar with the Democratic Republic of Congo, which has an upcoming election on December 20th. And some domestic and international press have rather been critical as far as like predicting that the election will not be fair and free, that it will be rigged, despite the fact that CENI has followed lots of recommendations, not only from the Carter Center, from Human Watch, and various other entities. Do you have any thoughts on that? So why is it that some international press, especially in the last 6 weeks or so, have just published publications that pretty much undermine all the effort that Seni is making to have a fair and free election, and despite the fact that they are saying yes, the elections are going to be held on December 20 as planned?
Yeah, so one of the criticisms actually of election observation or international election observation also is making predictions before the election happen, because you are already setting tone for an election that has not yet happened. But again, if we do not bring to light such issues, how then can we have informed interventions? You know, so it's a tricky situation, but really there has been sentiments about the media, international election observer organizations giving statements like the ones you are talking about before an election happened, because an election will have to happen. And so already you are creating an environment of distrust and possibly even violence, because you're talking about institutions. I would recommend more like closed conversations with the Seni, probably, to try and show them where it is that they are going wrong and how they can improve what they are doing, and maybe even be seen. I don't know, we do civic and voter education in Botswana as the electoral management, and also just engage maybe with the electorate, also be seen to want to have an election that is free and fair. Maybe that's something can help. Closed conversations rather than making statements that can incite violence before an election even happens. Yeah.
Yes, in the back corner.
Hi, my name is Daniela Sniglio. I'm an intern at the Wilson Center in the Scholars Academic Relations Office. So talking about an issue in terms of short deployment periods of election observers, I was curious if you had an idea of an ideal timeline of involvement on the ground to actually combat overstaying a welcome of foreign intervention, but also dealing with empowering NGOs and voter legitimacy.
I'd like to focus a little bit on coverage in the United States, because I'm certainly not an expert on election things. And excuse me, I don't have your name, but I'd like to follow up a little bit. That based on my own analysis, African elections have some advantages over American elections. In the United States, we have, as you know, 50 states, and each state comes up with its rules, and there's a feeling perhaps more in the South than other parts of the country, but I don't want to go there. New York State had an electoral map they've thrown out, but every state, there's a local political process. Thanks mainly to international observers and a strong belief in democracy in African countries, they have really focused on establishing logarithms and so on in other ways to assure that on a national level, the rules are the same. So you don't have a situation where polling booths in African-American neighborhoods aren't open on Sunday because more people vote there. You have basic rules. And those rules largely come from international things. What happens is that individuals come to the United States and they have their normal election complaints. But there's never any checking. No one ever comes back. Somebody comes up. Again, nothing particularly against the Catholic Church or anything, but in African countries, sometimes the churches are more politicized than in the United States, although with abortion, I'm not sure who's more politicized anymore. I mean, people get involved. So my real question is, since the international community has spent so much time establishing standards and ways to ensure election, isn't there some way that international observers early in the process, to go back to the point that was made, can at least make some judgments and say, excuse me, but there's two sides to this story, or such and such has done that. You've, in the Congo, all kinds of argument, oh, they're not registering enough votes, and all of a sudden you have 47, 49 million votes registered, and so on. But is there any opportunity for international observers to say, yes, you're following the rules, and we take note of that? We're not predicting the election result, because it would be cheating at the last day, but is there anything in the middle where you guys can come in and at least say things are going well, and there were two sides to every story? Thank you.
I think
We have just one more question. Was there one more
one
question?
more question. Yeah, I think that actually would answer her question. Follow up on the recommendations. I feel like that would help to institutionalize the recommendations that are made. So, yeah, follow-up is important, and it's something that is currently lacking, as you rightly pointed out. So it's something that international election observers should really consider adopting into their mandate, that we do follow-up of our recommendations, because otherwise then we have situations where recommendations are not implemented.
Okay, and thank you. There was one more question about the ideal time frame for an international election observer mission, so that they can better coordinate with actors on the ground.
Yeah, I think I answered it by saying maybe follow up after they leave, after the 6 months, and then they come and follow up on their recommendations. That I feel would be ideal. I'm not sure if they can change from 3 months or 6 months period, because an observer mission is also expensive to deploy into a country. But maybe what would be practical is for the follow-up mechanism of international election observer missions.
Okay, so I think with that, we still have one more question, or?
Yeah.
Yes, oh, sorry, another follow-up, okay.
I appreciate your answer, but the point was made earlier, good point, that sometimes the press, particularly in the West, can establish an environment where the election is unfair because of these reports that are not verified, that comes in from, let's say, people with political interest. So I think the question really is, well, look at CENI, for example. CENI had an audit carried out, SADC, a lot of respected people on it, and they said, so far you're doing okay. A couple of recommendations, which seem to have been put on. They have a schedule. Not at all covered in the Western press. So people come over from different issues, and they begin to say such and such is happening. But if you read the audit report, there's at least an argument. So my argument isn't whether CENI is doing a good job or not. My argument is, how can the international community play a role, and when there are statements made that are patently not correct, or something, at least weigh in or say there's another side of the story. Because what happens is, if you don't do that, by the time the election takes place, it's already in everybody's mind illegal. So I'm not sure the follow-up works, but I don't know a better solution, because your point is very legitimate as well. So I don't have an answer, but that's the issue I think I would go back on. Thank you for letting me ask a follow-up question.
I'm also not sure how to answer your question, because as we know, the work of election observers is really limited to witnessing and reporting on what they are seeing and making recommendations. And if there is space to engage with institutions that run the elections, then that can happen. But other than that, I don't know what else Yeah, thank you.
Okay, so I think we've come to the end of our time, and so if you could, please join me in thanking Galileo for her presentation, and thank you all to yourselves for the great discussion that we had, and thanks to those online who joined and asked questions as well. Thank you. If you want to learn more about Galileo's work, about the Wilson Center and its Africa program, or about the Southern Voices Network for Peacebuilding Scholars, I encourage you to look at the Wilson Center website, which is wilsoncenter.org. Thank you again for all coming, and have a wonderful rest of the day.